Peter Orpin. I'm a vet and also director of My Healthy Herd. In the next 5 minutes or so, I'd just like to share with you some pictures and some thoughts in terms of how Johne's disease looks, the clinical effects of it, and what the subclinical cow looks like in your herd. So this is the classical clinical cow. This animal has been scouring probably for some weeks, probably the last 2 weeks or so. You can see that she's got dirty hocks. You can see she's in poor body condition, and there is this quite dramatic loss of weight over the hindquarters. Typically these animals will also show disappointing yields as well, so we see a marked reduction in milk yield in the weeks preceding the clinical development of the disease. So, that is the classical presentation of Johne's disease. I'll share with you some more photos of the classical cases, just so you can get a real feel for the disease. This is another cow, slightly older this time. Again, very similar presentation. You can see that milk production has dropped, body condition has dropped, particularly over the hindquarters. And indeed, you can see this animal has been straining to scour as well. The diarrhea can be very profuse, and in this particular case, it's been so profuse it comes out of the cow almost like a pipe stem, and it's actually missing the cow completely. So there is no contamination of the hocks or the tail, and this often means that sometimes these clinical signs are missed. The diarrhea, it's profuse and foul smelling. Often has very small bubbles in it as well, so it's quite characteristic. So in herds where they've got the disease, often the actual farm workers can identify the clinical cases by looking at the diarrhea, looking at the animals, looking at the history of the actual animal as well. This is a case of a 27-month-old beef cross calf with clinical Johne's disease. Normally the disease is in the older animal, 3 to 6 years of age, but it's likely this calf may have been exposed to very heavy doses of calf, and as a consequence the incubation period can be shorter. So be aware, you can get it in younger animals, and you can certainly see it in animals less than 2 years of age in heavily infected herds. This is a beef cow, very similar presentation, same sort of symptoms. You can see there that there's marked body condition loss there, and you've got the development of bottle jaw, some degree of edema under the jaw in this cow. The cow remains reasonably bright and alert until such a point that she becomes very severe and emaciated and will eventually collapse with the disease. So just to summarise some of the key facts, it's a chronic wasting condition of cattle. It affects all ruminants and rabbits. The cattle become infected typically under 6 months of age, and it typically occurs in cattle 3 to 6 years of age. So you can see there's quite a long incubation period. The calf becomes infected, and then the infection lies dormant within the cow until a later stage when she loses control of the infection and develops clinical disease. We can get the disease occurring in younger animals, particularly when there's severe Johne's problems in the herd. So it's a poor sign. If you start seeing this disease in young animals, it normally means there's a large amount of infection within the herd. One key point to remember, though, is that it's an iceberg disease. And what I mean by that is that most animals are subclinically infected. So these are the carrier cows, and this is how infection commonly spreads between herds. And we'll talk about this in the other videos. The clinical sign summary: we've got scouring and weight loss, but often the animal remains bright until the point of the fact that she becomes very, very poorly. But normally during the early phases, she remains reasonably bright. You may see periods of remission, so she may scour and then stop scouring. These cows seem to be more susceptible to other problems. There's an association between mastitis, elevated cell counts, other diseases with Johne's disease. And in very advanced cases, we will see bottle jaw, emaciation and death. So this is a case of a very, very severe case of Johne's disease, the terminal case. These are rare. In well-managed herds, it's very, very rare to see these sort of animals, and they're usually culled in the earlier clinical phase or in the subclinical phase. So this is typically when we may see clinical cases. These again are relatively rare in well-managed herds. So it's not a good indicator to try and say, well, I can diagnose Johne's disease by looking for emaciated or scouring cows. That's not a very good way of diagnosing it within the herd, because these animals are often removed before you see the clinical symptoms develop. What are quite common within herds are what I call the preclinical cases, or heavy shedding cows. These ones will have weight loss, loss of milk yield, may get body condition loss, but they may not be scouring at this point. Now, these are very common, they're often underdiagnosed, they're usually culled because they're infertile or have a high cell count or low yield. So it may be possible that you've got a significant Johne's infection in your herd and you're not aware of it unless you start testing these sort of animals. So again, we'll cover this in the other videos, is that how to diagnose the infection involves trying to find these poor doing animals for testing, just to check that they've not got the disease. Now, who'd have thought it? This cow, she's a red tag cow, she's tested positive twice for the disease. She looks in really good condition. So you can see that Johne's disease in its early stages, this cow is subclinically infected, she's going to go on and develop the preclinical and then eventually the clinical disease probably in the next sort of 6 to 12 months. In the early stages, the cow looks perfectly normal. So we have a pyramid of infection and shedding within the herd. At the very top we may have these emaciated cows. It's very unusual to see them though. We occasionally might see a clinical cow. But below these we much more often, much more likely to see these cows if we've got the disease, just cows which are losing weight. But underneath these there's many, many cows which you may not recognise as of having the disease. So that's why it's important that if we are looking for the disease that we do have to test. Okay, just finally now, just the key points about the clinical disease. The clinical disease is rare in well-managed herds. So if you manage your herd well, it's unusual to see it, because you'll often remove these cows before they have time to show clinical signs. And that's the thing, we cull them before any symptoms are developed. Subclinical infection is very common, and for every clinical cow, some workers have suggested there may be between 10 and 25 subclinical cows in the herd. Not all of those will go on to develop the disease. Many of them may be removed for other reasons, but it just illustrates the point that clinical disease is really, if you do see it, you need to take positive action. Okay, well, hopefully you've managed to sort of glean some useful points about how you can identify the clinical disease in your herds. I'd like you to take note of the other videos which will look at how we test for the disease, how we control the disease, how we manage the risks. Thank you.